Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Joe Duffy. Joe is the founder and CEO of Palomi, a venture-backed startup in Seattle. Before Palomi, he was Director of Technical Strategy and Engineering at Microsoft, advising across all developer and cloud tools, programming languages, and advanced technologies. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So, Joe, before we get started into the meat of things, would you give our listeners maybe a little introduction to yourself? Tell them how you got started in the industry.
Yeah, actually, I started pretty early on. I decided to learn C and C++ when I was 13, 14 years old, which I would not recommend as your first programming language. But it was mostly around game development. So I really got excited about, actually back in the day, it was MUDs, multi-user dungeons, basically first wave of sort of online gaming. And in fact, it was all text-based back then, but that got me motivated to give it a try. And then, yeah, I ended up coding, doing websites and things like that during high school, and then ended up joining a company, joined EMC shortly after graduating, and ended up at Microsoft for a good 13 years, and now started a company.
Yeah. Okay. So, what was that transition for you like to moving from Microsoft and starting Palomi?
Yeah, Palomi. It was great, honestly. I was the kind of person that always was interested in both the business side and the technical side of things. In fact, when I was, early in my journey in high school, I mentioned building websites for people. I actually started a consulting company this is going to date myself, but to help companies, in their e-commerce transformation to get, to start using the internet when it was starting to become a thing. So I had that entrepreneurial bug from very early on. I was always reading business books and at Microsoft studying the business model, trying to follow where the money flows. It's incredibly difficult, it turns out, by design. But yeah, starting a company, it's kind of the way I put it is like I went from being, technical engineering director where I had to keep the whole code base in my head, and now I have to keep the whole company in my head. So it's kind of a very different thing. It's fun doing sales and marketing in addition to product and engineering, and the finance side of things as well. So big company to a small company, you have to I think I was always hands-on throughout my entire career, and that helped me because I know a lot of folks, you start depending on the system around you in a large company, whereas when you're doing something on your own, nothing happens unless you make it happen. And so that was probably the biggest part, relearning how to do, being the one developer on the team, building everything with my bare hands. But that was the fun part too.
Very cool. So what's a typical day for you like these days?
Oh, it changes. Literally every day is different. And it's kind of interesting. We're 3 years into the journey. So the first year of the company, we were in stealth. So we'd raised seed funding. And it was a lot of market research, talking to potential customers, writing a lot of code, writing prototypes. In fact, 4 months in, we had built a semi-working prototype that was good enough to raise, a seed round. But then making that reality took over a year to get the initial product and open source project done. Then the second year was more about, I'll say product market fit. So really I was going out to conferences, talking to end users, talking to customers, trying to do marketing, trying to figure out what the message was. So every day it was, hopping on a customer call, hopping on a flight to a different country to go to speak at a conference or staff the booth. And these days it's more about, systematic scale. So meeting with my staff, trying to figure out kind of what's working, what are the new things we need to try, what does the product roadmap look like, hopping on a customer call to help, close the deal with a customer or, start the conversation to make sure we're having a good relationship. Or maybe a partner, right? So we're doing a lot of partnerships. And so hopping on a call with a partner to talk through kind of strategic alignment. So it really changes on a daily basis, but that's what keeps it fun.
Very cool.
Okay. And for those that aren't as familiar, why don't you spend just a few minutes describing what Palomi is and how it could benefit you?
Yeah, so Palomi is a modern infrastructure as code platform. that allows you to do infrastructure as code using your favorite languages and tools. So, if you love Python, you can do infrastructure as code and still get all the benefits of declarative infrastructure as code, but with all the tooling, the libraries, the great editors, that you're used to, whether you're Python or Node.js or C# or, whatever, or Go. We now support Go as of a couple weeks ago. So that's great. So we bring a ton of productivity benefits to infrastructure teams who, frankly, every organization needs an infrastructure as code solution. So for infrastructure teams, it's a huge level up. They can share and reuse best practices. It's great. But it also makes it infrastructure more accessible to developers. And we're finding that increasingly developers are wanting to think about infrastructure as part of their application, whether that's because it's Kubernetes, services are becoming front and center, or maybe serverless is becoming part of their application architecture. They don't want to think of it as an afterthought. Really, increasingly, it's becoming part of how the application operates. And more importantly than either of those two things, it's really a bridge for both, infrastructure teams and developers to work better together. And that is coming from my background with developer tooling for over a decade, where really applying a lot of those lessons learned to the infrastructure space.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think developers are turning to infrastructure as code and self-provisioning infrastructure resources that way? Because, I mean, as a developer that has primarily worked in smaller shops or worked with small to medium-sized businesses, and they probably don't have their own IT pros, or they don't have their own cloud specialists. I'm used to having the keys of the kingdom and being able to spin up whatever I want to, whether it's in an Azure portal or on premises or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that's a big part of it is, especially, a born in the cloud startup, they don't want to introduce silos. They really want to say, hey, I've got a cloud engineering team, go build something amazing and use the cloud to do that. Infinite scale, access to, increasingly capable data services and AI services. I mean, it's just building in the public cloud from day one. It affords you the flexibility of not having these, two sides of the house to begin with. But I think increasingly, even, organizations that have the two sides, it really, want to empower developers because microservices really are part of a applications architecture. And one of the projects I worked on at Microsoft was kind of formative in research, was a distributed operating system where we've talked about distributed computing since like the 1960s. And then in the 2000s, we had multi-core, but like real distributed programming is finally here. And that's an exciting day for developers.
So, with that, how can engineers overcome the complexity of all of the infrastructure items? Because we've been working together in live streaming on Wednesday evenings, trying to get up to speed with Kubernetes project and work through a lot of those types of things. And it just seems like more and more as the industry evolves and as the options in differing clouds become available, that it's almost overwhelming to stay on top of all these things.
It is, and it's a vast landscape. I mean, AWS alone has something like 200 services you can choose from. The CNCF, landscape probably has about the same number of 200 projects or so. And so I think it's still early days. I think there's some things that really, frankly, most developers are just don't need to become experts in. And this is where I think the separation, I'm not saying that at the end of the day, infrastructure teams aren't required. Of course they are, right? Infrastructure teams are world experts in how to do networking, how to set up clusters, how to do security, how to make sure that the operation, everything is cost effective. I think developers, on the other hand, are just, trying to create new value, right? And deliver, and those are slightly different things. And so I think the key is how to help those two skill sets work together. That said, I think we're still super early days. If you buy the distributed computing kind of analogy, like we're still back in the days of assembly language, right? We're writing lots of YAML, configuring the really low level building blocks. And even to the extent that you can up level, you're still dealing with things at a much lower level of abstraction than most developers want to think, right? Why is it that you go on the whiteboard and you say, I'm creating a new microservice, and it's like easy, right? and then you go to actually make the thing, and it's hard. Like you thought about this thing as a couple, handful of building blocks, and then you go to codify it in YAML, and you've got 5,000 lines of YAML suddenly, and you're like, whoa, things got out of hand, right? I don't understand this gobbledygook. I understood the whiteboard diagram, but I don't understand this. So I think that we'll get there, but we're still, I think, very early days, and it's tough because it's so fast moving. Like you can't add abstractions until things settle down, right? And I look at kind of the history of operating systems and programming models. Went from assembly to C to C++. We eventually got to Node.js, where it's like super productive, and you don't have to think about the low level pieces. But we're still back in like the C and C++ days in the cloud.
So when do you think we're going to get there? When do you think we're going to settle down? What are the pointers that we can look to say, oh, we've gotten to this milestone. Now it's safe and easy and reliable and repeatable using simpler tools and simpler moving pieces and in order to get back to something that's a little bit more familiar to those of us that maybe have spent a lot of years in the industry, have remembering that it used to be just as simple as right click publish, but now with the inherent complexity of deploying microservices and accountability and maybe not having access to a production environment. So what are those things that we need to look for to alert us to that maybe we are getting to that point?
Well, believe it or not, I actually think of Kubernetes as a very important step in that direction, because now Kubernetes has basically kind of standardized the compute layer in some sense across many of the cloud providers. So now there's kind of a standard operating model where you know what a service is, you know what a pod is. There's some fundamental concepts, and it's hard because we need to relearn a bunch of those fundamental concepts. But it's kind of like we had to learn about processes and threads and async programming, right? And that wasn't easy. That took a long time to get right. And eventually, programming languages had to add features to make those things easier, like promises, async await. Like the underlying capabilities always lead. And then the improvements to usability and the programming models always trail, often sometimes by almost a decade in a sense. So I think Kubernetes gives us those fundamental concepts. It's definitely, I think, has some room to become simpler. In a sense, it's never perfect, right? I mean, like threading models, no matter which operating system you're dealing with, are always kind of gnarly and nasty and difficult. But you learn, right? And then books get written, it becomes part of the common knowledge of the industry. And so that's exciting for Kubernetes. But there's more to come, right? Like serverless still doesn't fit into that. So I'm the master of horrible analogies, but it's like, remember we had processes on Unix, and then there were, in Linux, and there were green threads, and now threading is pretty much a standard thing, right? So like serverless has not really woven its way into the fabric yet. But I think it will eventually.
So with our experimentation / learning with Kubernetes that we're doing on Wednesdays, I think I'm having the hardest time with it. I don't do a lot of DevOps type work, but I do have some experience with containers. But it seems like I have to learn 20 tools in order to do the simplest thing with Kubernetes. And I'm really interested in Pulumi because you're saying that we could do the similar stuff with just code, the language that we're comfortable with. Is the API that you guys have created, is it simple enough where you can do something simply, or do we still have some of that complexity?
Yeah, so that was one of the goals with Pulumi. Is we saw a lot of people having to stitch together, a dozen tools with bash scripts just to get one simple thing done. So we definitely took the approach of, the simple things should be simple and the hard things should be possible, right? And so that kind of guided our philosophy, and really also comes in like Kubernetes is not an island, right? Often, okay, say you need a database, right? And say you're running on AWS. Well, one of the paths is you could host MySQL from within your Kubernetes cluster and manage persistent volumes and go down that path. The alternative is you could spin up an RDS database and have Amazon host it, but then have all your application services running within your cluster and then just use that service. Well, the latter is usually a better place to start for most people, but it's hard because you have to stitch together these tools. So with Pulumi, we said, hey, you can spin up AWS resources, consume them from Kubernetes, then consume your Kubernetes resources back, from another set of resources. So really having that one consistent model across all these things without papering over what makes them special, because that's a key part of it as well. I think that was something that we're really focused on.
All right, and then it sounds like obviously it's very, very attached to cloud providers, but is there, like when you're building up one of these scenarios where you've got your services running in this thing, and you've got management applications over in this thing, and stuff spread out and woven together, is there a way to test that locally? Like, is there a way to run the Pulumi code on your own machine and verify that everything's going to work when you deploy it?
Yes, we have a lot of examples using Minikube and Docker, local Docker on your desktop, and we also make it easy for you if you want to test it in the real cloud. We make it easy to spin up ephemeral environments and test them, and then tear them down, either manually or in your CI system. But you can definitely do testing locally. In fact, as part of our recent launches, we actually published a bunch of guidance around how to test your code and all the different flavors of testing. So when somebody says they want to test test their infrastructure, there's usually like 5 different things they could mean, all the way from unit testing to integration testing to ephemeral environment testing. You even see some people doing fuzz testing, like what happens if my node pool dies? Does it fail over correctly? What happens if an entire region goes out? Things like that.
All right, that's awesome.
How about it's great for if your project is green and you're able to start in that public cloud, you're able to start there. What about, there's a lot of us who are pretty stuck with legacy applications. Maybe they want to move and transition into the cloud, but it's not really just possible to just straight up rewrite or lift and shift or whatever. So you have to have some sort of like hybrid environment. How does Pulumi handle that? Is that something that you guys do, or what do you guys recommend for people that are in that situation?
Yeah, for sure. We definitely recommend not trying to boil the ocean all at once. Usually, yeah, because that usually does not end well in our experience. But I think, to your point, like finding ways to carve out what is that application that you want to modernize, what is that new initiative that you're going to do some new work in, so you're not just converting things. Because we have a lot of conversion tooling to help you convert from existing infrastructure. If you pointed and clicked in the console, we have a way for you to sort of slurp that up and become under the control of Pulumi, or if you've used a different infrastructure as code tool. But usually it's more interesting if you have something new that you're doing. And so we have the ability to basically say, let's say you wanted to spin up an EKS cluster because you're starting to use Kubernetes, but your team already spun up, VPCs and, subnets and all these things. You need to fit into that. There's a way to say, hey, this Pulumi project actually depends on those other things. And so Pulumi projects are really meant to be little, I hesitate to use the word microservices because it's actually more about the infrastructure, but it's like, we call them stacks. So it's almost like little micro infrastructure stacks where you can really slice these things up into fine-grained pieces, and that allows you to experiment and then start building more complicated architectures as you go.
And what about for hybrid or multi-cloud environments? I know that the three of us have historically worked for a variety of different companies, some of which embraced new and cutting edge and bleeding edge technologies. Others we've had to come in and help modernize them. So often that means either taking the next greenfield project and moving that directly to the cloud and being cloud native with that new single application, or it's taking the approach of cutting up and moving out pieces and maybe dealing with part of it in-house, part of it in the cloud, maybe dealing with part of the applications in AWS and part of the applications in Azure. How do you, how do developers these days deal with the struggle of provisioning in these variety of environments.
Yeah, I think one of the keys, for us, we support lots of different clouds. So we do support AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Kubernetes. We also support private clouds as well. So, vSphere, OpenStack. We have over 36 infrastructure providers. Actually, things like Datadog, New Relic, these are actually part of your infrastructure as well and benefit from infrastructure as code. So the first key thing we do is give people a consistent approach so that, again, to this point earlier of not stitching together lots of tools that weren't really designed to work together, we allow you to standardize at that level. And so if your team's going to learn, one way of doing things, they can standardize on Pulumi. It's one set of languages, one workflow, one, if you want to do policy as code, it's one way of doing it. So that's key. We find that a lot of times when people are moving into either it's the first time going multi-cloud or it's the first time going to public cloud, they suddenly are faced with this challenge of, oh, we did it all this one way. How are we going to manage the infrastructure going forward? If they're in AWS, maybe they used, the built-in CloudFormation, and now they're taking that template, and now they're going to Azure. Now, well, that's ARM, right? So that's usually the first point where they take a step back and say, oh, okay, well, maybe a cloud neutral solution might be a wise approach. Because Pulumi is a language, or because it uses real languages, you get package managers, you get abstraction, and there's some tools there that actually help you deal with multi-cloud, right? Where a lot of times you're copy and pasting scripts all over the place and then making small tweaks here and there. With Pulumi, you can actually use real abstraction. You can have a class or a function, or and it's not like write once, run anywhere. That's kind of doesn't generally work, but at least you have tools to manage the complexity. And I think that's key.
So sort of speaking of some of that complexity, we talked about the proliferation of open source tools and proliferation of open source tools and how, depending on what your organization dynamics are like, you could be kind of in a difficult situation where some people are using some tools and other people are using other tools, and it can it could be difficult to get work done across teams and whatnot. What are some of the ways that you guys can solve that problem and make it easier and smoother for folks?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of tools that take a very specific, they try to solve like one specific problem, which is great. It's like the Unix way, right? Do one thing and do it well. Generally love that, but like at some point it becomes too much, and the interfaces between these tools they're not designed to work together. So we didn't, when we started, we didn't say like, oh, you must do serverless, or oh, you must do containers, or oh, you must do. We really said, hey, people we talk to are doing everything. They're doing serverless, they're doing containers, they're doing VMs, they're doing hosted databases, they're doing Kubernetes. Like it's all of these things. And so if you don't solve for the entire space of infrastructure automation, it's kind of actually making the problem worse in a sense. So that's one way that we help. The second way is we actually find this pattern, which is actually super interesting. Actually, over the weekend, Camille Fournier wrote an article about internal infrastructure platform teams. That's actually a pattern we're seeing emerge quite a bit, where, especially in large enterprises, there's like a platform team, which is like the central part of the organization that's doing, I'll say, cloud engineering, because it's like some app dev, some infrastructure, some security engineering. And like that platform is kind of the watering hole for everybody doing cloud infrastructure in the organization. So a lot of times we engage with that team, and then they can build their platform using Pulumi, and now they can go scale it to the rest of the organization. And they can also use Pulumi to interface with that platform. And that really helps. So now you have like one central place where you can see everything that's happening in the company or the team. That's one place to go to enforce standards, to, if you're using policy as code, to enforce those as well. So that's actually, I didn't kind of expect that going into it, but that's a pattern that's really emerging quite a bit, especially in the last year or so.
Okay.
So, I think you've intrigued me for sure for Pulumi, and writing C# sounds way better than a whole bunch of YAML and learning 20 different tools. So How does one get started with Pulumi? Is there what kind of resources do you have for doing that, or what's the process to get started?
Yeah, so Pulumi is entirely open source. The platform is entirely open source. So the SDK, the libraries, the engine, the frameworks, that's all open source up on GitHub. We offer a free SaaS for doing state management, which you can elect to use. You don't have to use it. That's actually one common misconception about how we've done things, and that's our fault. And we haven't described it very well. But so you download the open source, you go to pulumi.com, click the Getting Started button, you'll see it, and it will walk you through a tutorial for whichever cloud you want to go to. Super easy, get up and running in like 10 minutes. A lot of people tell us it's like the easiest onboarding experience they've had for getting a cloud app up and running. And then from there, we've got, over 100 tutorials and examples that you can, depending on where you want to take it. If you want to do a Redshift data warehouse or a Kubernetes cluster or a Kubernetes application, like there's a lot of different ways you can go from there. So we try to guide you through those next steps. But yeah, it's easy to get up and running. Just pulumi.com and click the blue button.
Fantastic. I'll be doing that tomorrow.
Oh, I should mention, we also have a community Slack. So if you ever run into anything, the whole team is there. We've got thousands of people that hang out there that are helping each other out. So it's a fun place to be, share infrastructure patterns. But if you want to just chat, or if you get stuck, that's the place to go.
Yeah, so I guess what sort of moving on maybe in a little bit different direction, but I mean it's kind of similar to what we're talking about. But just what do you think all of this growth in infrastructure of code really sort of means for developers? I know many developers. It's sort of an exciting thing, but it's also a scary thing to have this whole be opened up into this whole nother area of infrastructure and whatnot. Is it something for developers to lead into, and then maybe the IT as a whole? Like how does that change the face and the way that we're doing IT?
I'd say don't be scared. It's fun. I think Pulumi, you get to use your favorite language, and all these cloud services at your fingertips. It's incredible. Like you integrate those capabilities into your application, you'll be able to do things that I couldn't imagine 10 years ago, being able to do the things that we can do now with infinite scale. Of course, you pay for it, so that's the one thing you have to be careful about, is that you don't like blow through $100,000 in an afternoon because you're playing with lambdas or something. But actually, it's very hard to do given the pricing model. But yeah, I think of it as like, hey, these are capabilities you can integrate into your application. So it's fun and exciting. And I would hope that people lean into it. And I see a lot of people leaning into it. I mean, remember, my background was mostly development. I was working on app dev for my entire career. And I got excited about infrastructure because of the modern cloud capabilities. I think they fundamentally reshape everything we're doing with application development, or they should. And it didn't seem like they were. So that was kind of where we started Pulumi. In terms of the IT model, I still think, you're going to have these domain experts that are helping with the underlying infrastructure. And then I think developers will increasingly become self-serve. But really, it's got to be with guardrails. I think in these large organizations, how many times have you seen an S3 bucket that was, unprotected, open to the internet, and now somebody's slurped up, sensitive data, right? And so I think that's something top of mind also for a lot of these enterprises. They're afraid to give away the keys to the kingdom, right? So how do you do that but still have guardrails? I think is important. I think on the hobbyist side, you'll see a ton of people just experimenting with new low-code platforms. But I think the enterprise is where the rubber meets the road, if you will.
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of concern that you have to have for security, especially if you're new to the cloud or moving into the cloud and utilizing even 1/10 of the offerings available. And if you don't have the expertise on staff for that, it can be incredibly daunting and nerve-wracking to even contemplate doing that. One of the clients that I worked with in the last few years, they were hesitant to move to the cloud because their own network was safe and secure. But really what that means was their own internal network was cut off from the outside world. And they really didn't have to concern themselves with the amount of security issues that they might encounter if they were publicly available and public facing. And I think that's going to start opening up the minds of developers and IT staffs and companies and organizations when they realize that maybe their applications weren't as secure as they needed to be originally and throughout the years, and really they need to start taking on the job of securing their applications, especially when they're moving to the cloud. And that becomes an issue for developers that don't have historical knowledge of networking and security and those types of things. So I think it's a whole new world that we're going to have to become experts in even more broad topics.
Yeah, and honestly, the surprising thing for me is just how early we are in the cloud journey. Like, it's clear a lot of people are still in a world where their company manages their own data centers. They're running on-prem. In many cases, it's for a good reason, and like the transition, if they're, they're still going to make the transition, but it needs to be a responsible one done at the right pace when there's ROI on that investment. So, but a lot of developers that are in those sort of companies right now might not be getting exposed as much to these technologies. And I think that's the other thing we find is we often hear, one of the comments about Pulumi sometimes is like, hey, okay, it's great to have real languages, but do we really think sysadmins and IT pros are going to go for that? And what we're seeing is, yes, a lot of these folks have been exposed to scripting over the years. They've done, Chef, Puppet, Ansible, SaltStack. Often we hear, hey, by learning a language, if I learn Python, I'm investing in my skill set. I'm learning something new that will transcend anything that I'm doing today. It's something that, like, down the road is going to come in. It will make me more marketable as an engineer. And I think that the same is true of learning public cloud. If you learn how to master the public cloud in your software development, daily software development, that's hugely valuable for you as an engineer going forward, and the marketability of your skills. If you leave that company that's still on-prem, you can actually go to one of these innovative places and at least have sort of a starting point to work with.
Very cool. So for someone, I know we kind of talked a little bit, but what resources would you kind of point people towards if they're looking to get started in infrastructure of code, or just trying to understand, maybe getting into the cloud, maybe getting to Pulumi? What resources might you have for those folks?
Yeah, so I think, our getting started guides that I mentioned are a good place to start. The key thing from there is it's easy to get lost. So I would say, like, have an idea of maybe a hobby project or, something that you want to try. For example, one of my favorite things to do with Pulumi, frankly, is to spin up a new serverless application that does something fun, like a Slack bot. Every hour, post the number of GitHub stars on your project to your company Slack or something, or screen scrape something and send yourself an email. I mean, it's like very easy to just do some fun things. In fact, I automated some things around my house doing this, and Pulumi makes that really easy. But it could be, hey, maybe you've got a Java application and you want to run it in Fargate on Amazon. That's a great thing with Pulumi. You can do that, in an afternoon. If maybe it's your first time dealing with Docker, it's going to take, a weekend or a few days. But it really is the kind of thing that if you can dream it, kind of is like it's at your fingertips. And so, a lot of our tutorials will help you through those sort of targeted things. And then from there, you see the value. And then hopefully from there, you can see, oh, here's how I would use this in my day job. Maybe now is not the right time, right? Like, bringing in a new technology to an organization, to your point earlier, that's like a major decision, right? And so we know that even if you have that aha moment, it may not be the right time, but at least now you've learned what's possible. You can keep it in mind. maybe keep tinkering with it, and then that opportunity may come down the road.
Mm-hmm. To kind of close in a different direction, all the guests we have on, we ask them to kind of give some specific advice to folks maybe getting started in the industry or looking to try to level up their careers. Do you have any words of wisdom that you would sort of speak directly to those listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll use a piece of advice I got early in my career, which is never stop learning new things. I think that, I was one of the best pieces of advice I got was when you're evaluating your next career, move, optimize for the thing that's going to force you to learn the most. Sometimes go out of your comfort zone, sometimes stretch a little bit beyond your capabilities. But I think that's how you continually improve, how you continually learn things, how you're always challenged and excited and that's how you find opportunities that will really propel your career to new heights. I'd say it may be uncomfortable at times. Sometimes it's never easy to be in a place where you feel like, hey, I'm the dumbest guy in the room, which is what I always feel like. But I think in the long run, that really pays off.
Very cool. And if our listeners wanted to follow you or reach out to you in any way, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, so Twitter, Funk of Joe is my Twitter handle. Unfortunately, Joe Duffy was already taken. I have a blog, joeduffyblog.com. Also, our community Slack. I'm just Joe. Slack.paloomi.com. We welcome everyone. It's open. You've got lots of people there. I'm always there. So any of those mechanisms, worst case, email me, joe@paloomi.com.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I had a great time.
That was Joe Duffy. Joe is founder and CEO of Paloomi, a venture-backed startup in Seattle. Before Paloomi, he was director of technical strategy and engineering at Microsoft, advising across all developer and cloud tools, programming languages, and advanced technologies.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
Catch us live each week on Twitch, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.